I'm Mark Gagan and you're listening to the Voice of Insurance podcast, produced in association with Advantage Go. Pick and choose your own best-of-breed insurtech and data providers with Advantage Go's ecosystem. Today's a first. I've had many senior industry executives on the show who have started their careers as actuaries, but I've never met anyone who already knew when they left school that they definitely wanted to be one. Martin Burke is different, and this is what makes him an excellent podcast guest. In his own words, he's walked something of a squiggly career path that has brought him to his current position as Chief Underwriting Officer at Lloyd's stalwart MS Amlin. But having walked all the bends in the road to get where he is now has made Martin an extremely well-rounded CUO. It's obvious none of his time spent on reserving, pricing, and in the finance and risk departments has gone to waste. To rerun the cliché, actuaries aren't famous for being great communicators, but that just makes the ones who are stand out. Martin has the gift of the gab, and that makes him a high-value guest to someone like me, an interviewee who can understand and, more importantly, summarise and explain complicated ideas in a way that lay people can understand, is podcasting gold dust. And when that person is also responsible for profitably growing a £2 billion book in today's market, this makes for a complete and satisfying listen. Here we run through MS Amlin's strategy in an evolving market and take in Martin's views on an eclectic range of topics, including the impacts of the latest major loss activity on insurer and reinsurer appetites, the best applications of technology and AI, as well as his priorities for where he feels the London market should be developing as a collective, as the leadership regime at Lloyd's transitions. I think you'll find Martin fun to spend time with, and full of surprises. Enjoy the podcast. Martin, welcome to the Voice of Insurance.
Thanks very much for having me, Mark. Lovely to be on the podcast.
Why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners, so anyone who doesn't know you? Tell us a bit about your career to date, sort of how you got into insurance and how you've ended up where you are today.
Maybe I'll start with how I got into insurance then. So I always knew I wanted to be an actuary. So when I went to university, I studied actuarial mathematics, but I wasn't entirely sure.
No, wait a minute. Now we need to start on the origin story of that. Yeah. How did you know you wanted to be an actuary?
Well, to be honest, it always came with a fascination with the numbers game on Countdown. And it started there.
So you could always get the number?
Well, I wouldn't like to blow my own trumpet, but it was always the bit I liked best out of that. And I suppose it just naturally flowed into a tendency to like more mathematical subjects. I did science and maths, and then I sort of naturally flowed into being an actuary. My sister was an accountant, my brother was an architect, so I started at A on the careers list at the back of the UCAS form, and I only got as far as actuary before I thought that sounds like the right thing for me.
And then, so naturally you were bound to end up insurance one way or another once you became a qualified actuary?
Yes, I suppose so. It feels natural now. So what happened, very short origin story, the year before I graduated, I had an internship at a life insurance company in London, Commercial Union. And actually, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. I was at university in Edinburgh, so it seemed like maybe pensions or life insurance was a good idea. But everyone I met that summer said, you do not want to work in life insurance. You really want to go and work in general insurance. And being that I didn't know any better.
It's more boring, isn't it? Surely. There's all these big numbers are more predictable. And I suppose you're trying to work out projecting forward pension deficits and how much a company has to put in to keep their pension solvent and all this stuff.
Yes, I suppose in retrospect now, it seems like an obvious choice, like I say. But actually, at the time, it sort of all looked the same when you're looking out at the start of your career. But I got this advice pretty much uniformly from people. And I thought, well, if everyone's saying it, maybe there's something in it. So when I was applying for roles, I applied for roles with more of a general insurance angle to them. But I still needed a job, so I did apply for some life insurance roles as well. But in the end, I ended up getting a job working for a commercial union just next door to where we are today.
Yeah.
The building that's maybe shortly going to be coming down. And that was in the general insurance side of that business.
How long did you stick around there?
Yeah, so I was a trainee, and that sort of meant what it says, I suppose, on the tin. I was learning various things. I started working in their sort of UK actuarial team, doing reserving, so some of the sort of basic actuarial skills. I stayed for about 2.5 years before I realised maybe I wanted something more. Again, even at that point, wasn't entirely sure, but that's when I moved into a role at Wellington Underwriting in the Lloyd's market, and that was about the year 2000, and I haven't really looked back since. Lloyd's London market, that's the space I now realise I was lucky enough to join and get into that market. And yeah,
so then Wellington was Catlin, and then how long was it before you got into Amlin?
So I've only moved jobs twice. So the first one was to move from Commercial Union to Wellington, and then I was 6 years Wellington and then 6 years Catlin. So I stayed across that. At my time there, so I stuck with actuarial for quite a few years, and then about 2005 I moved into pricing, so another actuarial discipline, and then about a year after that, not because I didn't like pricing, but because an opportunity came up, I actually moved into finance. So I was working in the finance team when the Wellington-Catlin merger happened. Stayed there for a few years through the Catlin integration phase and beyond, and then I moved into risk management, so all still within Catlin. That brings you up to about 2012. At that point, I essentially got a job working for MSI, so the Mitsui Sumitomo Syndicate at Lloyd's, as Chief Risk Officer. And I suppose, again, in the way things have worked out in my career, I'm really glad of the fact that at that point, having had a few years of experience, but with an actuarial background, it seemed to push me in that direction. And I really enjoyed working in risk because I'm a nosy individual by inclination. And I really enjoyed sort of getting involved in all the different parts of the business. And it was a small business then as well. It was a small syndicate in the market, had been around since about 2001, had gone through some remediation, so was in a bit of an upcycle of its own. And I was able to join at a really nice time for that business.
And of course, you're the MS part rather than the Amlin part. So.
Yes, yeah. Although that was 2012, fast forward to 2016, that's when the Amlin integration happened. And I remember at the time saying to a lot of people in my team, just to really push on and integrate yourself. It's a bit like promoting yourself in your mind first. You just have to go and integrate yourself into the new business and move on with what's happening. So I very quickly, even when I maybe wasn't even allowed to officially, I sort of started showing up in this building. So rather than the old building, and the risk team got together very quickly after that. 6 months in, post-acquisition, I then moved into a portfolio management role here. So that was working with the CUO, very much focused across all the entities of the group and concentrating on performance management. A lot of the analytics that actually sat across that, using the knowledge that you gain from doing all that analysis to actually step back and look holistically at the portfolio. So I suppose I was doing that for almost 7 years through quite a bit of change in the business. Laterally, I moved to focus just on the syndicate business. So in 2021, concentrating just on the MS Amlin syndicate. And then at the end of 2023, I had the invite from Andrew Carrier, our CEO, to actually move across into the CUO remit. So I've been doing that for a little while now and just been really enjoying it all the way along. I've seen a lot in the business and how it's changed. And in some way, you sort of start to link yourself into the prospects of the business, I suppose. But it's been really pleasing to move into a role where, I'm now responsible for the P&L, but I've been responsible for constructive criticism of the P&L for quite a while. So it's actually good to wear a different hat and to take a different level of responsibility for this.
Yes, I think that's pretty good training to have to calculate all the different parts of that P&L. You're looking at the risk that you're taking on, you're looking at the reserving after you've taken that risk on and had losses. You're also looking at pricing as well, which is obviously the closest to underwriting. It's fascinating. So you're a very well-rounded individual. And also it's interesting that you've been taken over and you've done the taking over, but essentially it sounds like the process is very similar.
Yes,
you have to go and assimilate with a new bunch of people and you've got to accept it and just crack on with it and see the opportunities.
Yeah, I expect in everyone's career that has to happen at least once. It's happened to me. Well, actually, to be fair, I was partial to 2 mergers while I was at Commercial Union because that became CGU and then Aviva. But those were maybe much earlier on. But yeah, it's definitely going to happen multiple times in people's career. The way I've described my career now, again, just retrospectively looking backwards, is I'm definitely ascribing to having a squiggly career because things can move in different directions at different times. But I've had great opportunities. I've had some sponsorship along the way, and it's really helped to generate some great options at different points in my career. I suppose my actuarial roots are still there. But whenever I'm talking to other actuaries in our business, what I say to them is actually it's the optionality that it gives you in your career and what you can do with it. But it don't want to be too heavy, but it doesn't define you, but it does give you a great skill set that you can build upon.
Well, certainly, yes. I think there are lots of top people in the industry who have had that actuarial background and it does set them apart. You can't replicate that. There are plenty of the CEOs that haven't had that background, but plenty that have. And it's a hell of a skill to bring, isn't it? I mean, it's something you can't suddenly just make it up.
That's true. But I would say the years I spent in risk management were really also formative for me. I suppose that what I have thought of before, people think of career paths. I think of a career path as maybe like, a very straight Roman road. But actually quite often you can veer off the road because you have to experiment and try different things. And for me, I suppose at least 2 parts of my career where I felt fully aligned was actually when I was a reserving actuary all those years ago, but also more recently when I've been doing the portfolio management role and now this CUO role, I really realised that I want to be involved in the story of the business. That's the critical thing. And those many years ago, part of the value that I felt I brought then, and actually why I got a job in finance as a result, was because I did understand the business and how it worked from having been in the engine room. So I suppose I'm still there now, but it's just from a slightly different vantage point. But it's a great place to be.
I suppose the other thing that's always differentiated actuaries who have ended up with a really diverse career and obviously end up running companies, for example, and having, C in their job title, has been that they're good communicators. Which, of course, is the great cliche of there's all those actuarial jokes, et cetera, running around our industry.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, some of those stereotypes are reasonably true for probably the people who are never going to leave the actuarial side of things. And you're not one of those. And it's always great from my perspective when I meet an actuary who's really good at communicating, because it really helps, and they're really good at helping explain some of those slightly complicated ideas that are behind their thinking. Obviously, there are a lot of actuaries who are less good at that. And that's where you can really differentiate yourself.
Yeah, and just on the current role, if I talk about that, I do spend a lot of time actually communicating now, and it really has become part of the course. But that's from talking to the entire underwriting team. We get together every month. There's a transparent clarity I like to bring to that communication to underwriting teams, but then also communicating all different levels of the organisation. And I suppose that doesn't descend on you overnight, but it is about being able to tie in with different audiences. And again, I've been lucky to have those opportunities to learn along the way. I wouldn't say I've perfected it, because there's always more that I can learn from that going forward, but it's all amounted to a great opportunity in what is now a fantastic business.
Of course, you're already proving you're a great communicator because you're on the podcast. So
Thank you.
We're up to date. MS Amlin, where are we at now? It's been an interesting story. Obviously, it's been a lot of change, reorganisation, re-underwriting, come through all that process, and now everything's back on the front foot again. Give us a bit of an update on where we are now, today, in 2025.
Yeah, the state of the nation of the business, I suppose, is that today the syndicate business is just under 500 people or so. We have grown our book in the last few years from 2021 to 2024. In 2024, we will get to about £2 billion of premium that we've written. I would just say that's in old money, so accountants might see it slightly differently. But in underwriting old money, it's about £2 billion. So I'm going to stick to that. And we're really benefiting from a strong 2023, which felt like a real watershed moment for the business. It was a landmark result we had at the time. Profitability over £250 million. Our net combined ratio was 86.6, and it hadn't been at that level for quite a while.
Yeah.
In 2024, we're really maintaining that momentum. Can't talk about any numbers just yet because we're slightly in that interregnum period where things are being put together. But the momentum is strong going into 2024, and that's really pleasing to see, because fundamentally what we're trying to build is a sustainable track record in terms of the performance of the business. And for 2023, 2024, that's definitely coming together, but the track record needs to continue, and that is clearly what we're focused on, which is why it's full-time capacity looking at what we're doing in 2025.
So would it be fair to say that you've kind of retrenched the things that you're really good at, and then you know that you can sustainably be good at? Do you think you can make a return over the cycle in those classes of business that you think you're expert enough or important enough in those classes that you'll be able to have an edge and make a return over the cycle? Is that the strategy? Would it be to go deeper into those things? Perhaps the criticism of what happened at MS Amlin before was that it went quite broad and a bit shallow, and now you've retrenched to your core.
Yeah.
Is the plan now to go deeper into the core stuff and grow there?
Yes, so if I concentrate on the go-forward aspect. So I suppose the way I think about the portfolio now is we did some work in 2023, which is a while ago now, but we had a good look at our strategy for the next 3 to 5 years at that point. One of the guiding principles there, so our North Star, was let's look at what an optimal portfolio looks like, what the type of mix we want, and then really going through that natural step you go through with strategies as to how do we get from here to there. And again, in terms of an optimal portfolio, then maybe you never get exactly there, but it helps you design your next steps you need to take. So during 2024, we've been taking some of those next steps. And that's really included concentrating in 3 separate spaces in our portfolio. So first and foremost, we identified from looking at our peers and others in the market that actually fundamentally we were somewhat underweight in casualty business. So both casualty insurance and casualty treaty. And during 2024 and again in 2025, we're absolutely making steps in that regard in both of those spaces. So we intend to grow more than proportionately. So we have an overarching aim to sort of grow modestly over the period, so to grow from 2 billion towards 2.5 billion over a 3 to 5 year period, but actually it's more proportionate growth in those casualty lines. Then we have what I would determine more of a core book of business, which incorporates things like crisis management, marine, natural resources, specialty reinsurance lines that we write. And there we'd intend to grow largely proportionately over that period, and then less emphasis on growth in our sort of property and property treaty books of business. And that's because historically we have had quite a big component of the book has been that short tail property component. We like the book we have. We've undertaken, as you said, a lot of work on that book of business. But really going forward, it feels like we need to balance up the portfolio by, in essence, of concentrating on those other lines of business and bringing them to the right contributor to the business. So by balancing across the lines of business, that's the aim to get to that optimal portfolio. Practically, in 2024 and 2025, you tend to think about strategy at the sort of top level. In reality, strategy gets delivered by lots of little opportunities that we work on. So if I think of 2025, we ended 2024 at about 2 billion. 2025, we aim to get to somewhere between 2.1 and 2.2 billion of premium. But in reality, in line with our plan, that's about 1.8 billion of core business and about 400 million of new initiative business. So we look at it that way because actually increasingly, like I said, with this focus on opportunities, it really is about bringing those new initiatives home. That makes the difference between us actually getting to that medium-term strategy in the first place. Those new initiatives tend to be many and varied, but it can include things like a focus on cyber treaty business that we went into in 2024, or even this week we announced that we've recruited a new underwriter for credit and political risks in our Dubai office. So lots of things that help contribute towards that growth agenda, but it has to be said that core book of business can't be ignored. It needs time and work. We focus on our clients who make up that 1.8 billion. They are very important to us, but we're also looking at this longer term health, this balance we want to build in, which helps us with our financial strength going forward.
When we last spoke, it was down in Monte Carlo, autumn last year. We were having that big debate collectively as an industry about casualty, and you had that cautious optimism about growth. How did that bear out? It sounds like it bore out pretty well.
Yeah, well, I suppose I can take the opportunity here to really put a shout out to our casualty and casualty treaty teams, because in terms of how things have performed in 2025 renewals, it's been a fantastic start to the year, really pleasing. And that is them being able to deliver on their plans, but also in line with our appetite. So we're very much aligned there. But the level of work in both of those teams, and there's a really good pipeline of opportunities in both of those teams. So yes, that combined with the fact that the market is holding to a reasonable degree in both of those spaces. It should be said in terms of casualty insurance, our main emphasis there is typically business through delegated authorities. So it's more small and medium enterprise business. Particularly, we don't tend to write a lot of large commercial business. So open market is much less of a feature of that portfolio, and therefore maybe you're not as exposed to some of the vagaries of the market that get more publicised in some lines in casualty. But it's nonetheless that work is making sure that we're actually really managing the cover holders, the underlying clients, that we have our territories are delivering. So we have profile internationally as well as the US in the casualty insurance space. But both of those teams have done a fantastic job. I couldn't ask for more.
We read about nuclear verdicts, but I suppose everyone needs liability insurance in most commercial activity. But in small businesses also need it, but they're not to be the sort of businesses that a jury are wanting to make an example of if it comes to court or something. But if you're an enormous FTSE 100, Fortune 1000 company, then juries probably feel a little bit more free to let rip.
Yeah, and that's definitely a space that we tend to stay away from, not just for that reason, but you can definitely agree with that hypothesis, and those type of things do happen. But our emphasis, like I said, on that SME space and particular niches as well. So we tend to concentrate on niches like healthcare, or we'll have specific low hazard occupancies that we concentrate on in other territories as well. But in sticking with those niches, that really helps us to understand the risk to the best of our abilities and then to be able to manage against those type of volatilities.
Casualty's been a market with more opportunity, let's say, because there has been more variance of appetite amongst insurers, reinsurers, specialty insurers. What about the market overall? Certainly the anecdotal evidence from the reinsurance side of things is that things were coming off a little, but coming off from a very nice place within the reinsurance book. Is that about right? Your phraseology was you felt that we were coming a bit past high tide, but obviously presumably there's plenty of water left. We're not going to start hitting rocks.
Yeah, there's plenty of water left, but I think the point there is that the tide has started to go out a little bit, and maybe I'll leave the analogy there at that point. But yes, in terms of our overall reinsurance book, this is where everyone can indulge themselves as a little bit of an amateur economist. But, there is a bit of a supply and demand thing that just naturally happens at these sorts of points in the market cycle. And what you can observe is that many reinsurers were trying to write more business at year end, and then that naturally has an effect on tempering the market somewhat. We were nonetheless relatively pleased with the outcome because we had put some effort into our business plan in Q3 last year, Q3 going into Q4, and we didn't have perfect predictability because we'd be applying it to other things if that was true. But broadly speaking, we have actually ended up in line with our plan, which is not a bad place to be at this point, because I think the fear was that maybe there was even going to be a disconnect with what we were planning for. But actually, that's partly down to features like some business being maybe loss affected, which gets adjusted for in rating. But actually, across our insurance and reinsurance lines, we've ended up pretty much on target with A, what we wanted to write in January, and B, actually our view on how the rating levels have changed.
You're talking about loss affected things, obviously now more recently anecdotal. Obviously, since we spoke, we had Hurricane Milton, which didn't seem to be anecdotally have affected the 1/1s that much, although it kind of accelerated any softening. Now we've had the LA wildfires. Is anything readout coming from that, do you think, that might temper some of this tide turning?
It's maybe just a little bit early to tell yet.
We're starting to see some numbers come through.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
There's some numbers coming through. There's a whole range of market loss estimates attached to the wildfires. There's lots of uncertainties. There's the jurisdiction involved, but also things like additional living expenses, smoke damage.
And you've got subrogation potentially, as always.
And yeah, definitely potential for subrogation maybe later in proceedings, but there's clearly litigation in place already in relation to that loss. So it's hard to tell what the impact is because there's still quite a lot of counting the cost going on. My own view is that maybe later in the year, so as we get through the year a little bit more, then I think you may get some level of change during the year in the market. So maybe some recognition of the fact that this is certainly going to be significant for the reinsurance market.
You say, well, it's only 20 billion here and then this one's only 20 billion there, but it all adds up.
Yes. And I suppose in relation to this loss, particularly the LA wildfires, as much as it was a horrendous loss to have happened and there was loss of life and everything else, the impact is probably more keenly felt in reinsurance than in the insurance market because of just the way it's impacting a finite number of insurers. They've all got a program attached, and as the cost gets counted, more of that comes to reinsurers.
We've seen some anecdotal evidence about potential for high net worth, the sort of fine art, the sort of nice house in the hills with, with a Picasso in them, that kind of thing. We've certainly picked up some chatter around that. And obviously that's something that is a core Lloyd's segment, for example. Do you think there's anything in that likely?
We participate in most parts of the market. So we have a profile in specie. As far as our information is concerned, then I suppose it is quite mixed in terms of people's experience in that space. There are quite a lot of high-value homeowners there. There's quite a lot of high-value art as well. But what seems to be the case is a lot of people did try to take as many preemptive measures as they could at the time. So they were thinking on their feet in a very difficult set of circumstances. And a lot of clients appear to have acted with the intent of trying to protect the assets. So that will be another uncertainty that emerges over coming months. But so far on specie particularly, I would say that's probably where most of the uncertainty sits because one or two high-value items can make a big difference on that. But that sort of element of the loss so far looks like it's relatively controlled because those are high-value assets and they're looked after very carefully.
If I owned a Picasso and heard there was a wildfire coming up, I'd probably make sure I got someone to take it away.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it can be as straightforward as that. In terms of the high net worth homeowners, I suppose the one thing I think to talk about there is that market in particular. It was in quite a lot of flux in California prior to the loss. There's been quite a lot of changes, some insurers who've been trying to reduce their share of that market, yes. And then quite a lot more business being picked up by the California Fair Plan. So there's an awful lot of hand gestures of things going up, things going down. So quite a lot of changes there. And in reality, coming out of this loss, I think that still leaves a big question mark on how can this market be best served? What can we do as an industry to try to put some structures in place to be able to both offer people cover, but also help to promote this attitude of actually trying to help manage the risk, because there is risk living in these areas. In retrospect, these things always look more obvious than they appear prospectively, but there's something I think we can do as an industry to try to help put a better structure.
It was certainly an interesting number, and Howard and Ree reports came out very recently, $6 billion of mitigation, loss mitigation. I presume this is kind of fire breaks or redesigning streets or saying cut down that tree or don't put a pile of logs next to your house. That $6 billion of that would have produced a $75 billion return. I don't know how they managed to work that out. But again, so you can see that loss prevention is so often better than cure. And if the insurance industry is helping to give credit for those who are spending that kind of money on mitigation, then it could be the start of a virtuous circle and something where we can have a broader conversation with obviously people who are making public policy and all sorts of other things. But I suppose now is a good time to have that conversation because it's properly on the agenda.
Absolutely. I think all the different options should be on the table. So admittedly, trying to have insurance support makes sense for the people, but actually, as you've highlighted with the Howden example, trying to figure out what the best place is to try to put some additional mitigation measures in place, it can have a very big effect both on the people living there, because no one wanted the house to burn down, right? And it really would give them some safety, but it would also just help really change that market into a market that functions more easily as a result.
We're not really anyone to talk. We're sitting in the city of London, burnt down in 1666. And you think, well, of course, one of the reasons why it burnt down was because it was a medieval layout where everything's living cheek by jowl on top of each other.
Yes, yeah.
And it probably would be better to build it back with nice boulevards and nice wide space in between each other so we don't have, conflagration so easily. And of course, the first thing everyone did was start building immediately, almost the day after it was over, because sorry, I own this bit of land, no, you own that bit of land, I'm building on my land, and we'll just crack on.
Yeah.
So, yes, you always think, it would be nice to do these things, but hard to do. Something to bear in mind for the future. To summarise that, you say it's a bit too early, really, to say how bad it's going to be. And sometimes when you have an outlier, is that the thing that tends to change the market? Something that suddenly produces a sort of salutary tale for everybody else to say, goodness me, that could have been us. We probably need to be more cautious. Is that the way that the market moves? Almost the psychology of it? Something genuinely unexpected happens, or if everybody comes in within the sort of numbers everyone was expecting, and everyone said, well, it's business as usual, we probably got it right, so that's okay, therefore everything can carry on as it was before. Do you think in the psychology of the market, it needs something to be totally unexpected? Like New Orleans, it's got these flood barriers maintained by the Marines, and they're supposed to work, aren't they? And then it's only when they don't work that they think, oh, we didn't really model that.
Yeah, I suppose it isn't just a case of the modelling maybe, but I think it does depend. As you said, it's a point of psychology as to the impact of the event and just how many questions that makes people ask. As I said, I've been in the market for a while now, but I've been through World Trade Center, I've been through Katrina, Rita, Wilma that you were referring to with the levees in New Orleans. And in both of those cases, there was definitely just a wholesale level of recognition that maybe the risk we thought was at a level is actually now at a completely different level. And that's when the market shifts. In relation to this loss, I suppose what I'm saying is that maybe things still need to work their way through, but the industry itself is in a much better capitalized position than it's probably ever been for the longest of times. So although there's likely to be some sort of recognition, I think, as we go through the year, I don't think we're talking about anything in the same space as WTC. Or
I suppose wildfire's already been on the radar from 6-7 years ago. That it's not as if this is the first wildfire we've had in that region. It's
definitely true. I forget how many of the top 20 wildfires have been in the last 10 years, but I think it's quite a few of them now.
Yes. Let's talk about the market in general. I was walking past Lloyd's to come here. Lloyd's in a bit of flux itself. It's quite rare that you get a chairman and a CEO transition happening at the same time. They tend to be sort of staggered. So we're going to get those at some point this year, one presumes. So when a new CEO, new chairman comes in, they tend to do the rounds, and then you might be asking for a nice lunch or something, one hopes, or sit by the fireside or whatever, canvassing you for how you're feeling and what you would like, anything you think needs to be changed. What should be my top priority? Then they're going on a kind of listening tour. What would you be saying to them? What would be your top priorities for that new regime?
Yeah, that's flattering to have a chance to answer that question. And maybe if in time the new CEO and chairman are listening to this, they can invite me along and we can replicate this conversation. One thing about podcasts is
they have quite a long sell-by date for something that people could listen to them in about a year's time. So yes, if it isn't a year's time, then if you're listening.
If you're listening, I'm here and ready. I suppose what I would say is that in the current climate, I feel like there's a huge priority of diversity and inclusion in the market. And I know the current leadership at Lloyd's has done a lot in this regard, but there's still a lot more to do. And you can see that in things like the Inclusive Futures campaign that Lloyd's launched not that long ago. MS Amlin are a signatory to that, and we've actually recruited an apprentice off the back of it, but that's for ethnically diverse individuals, trying to help them from the classroom into the workplace. And I feel that in the current climate that we're in, it's really something that I'd like Lloyd's to double down on and really keep putting a lot of emphasis behind, because there's a huge amount of influence that Lloyd's implement on the whole market, both the Lloyd's market but also the London market in this space. There's definitely further changes that could be made across the marketplace that would really enhance our ability to be representative of communities that we operate in. And I feel that's hugely important. We as a business have done a lot of work in this space, but it's something that you never perfect. It's a little bit like your underwriting strategy. You're always working on it. But some of the metrics we can look at as a business and say, well, we're quite proud of where we've been. 2020, we had 8% of women in senior leadership roles, and we've actually got to 36% now, which admittedly is not 50%, or I think maybe even 51% of the population, that we're not fully there. But there was a target that was set for the market of 35, and we've reached that. But we have to keep pushing forward with that. We absolutely have got, both in terms of our employees that we've been asking to disclose more about their background so we can understand them more and we can actually do more for them. I feel that that's something that across the market, Lloyd's does do lots of things very well, just be clear, but one of the things they do well is they help to raise the bar for everyone. And the new CEO, the new chairperson of Lloyd's, I would like to see you raising the bar on this.
Certainly more of the same, more continuation of what's been going on. And I suppose mathematically it's easier to get, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but 14 more from 36 is a lot easier than 8 to 36, isn't it? 4.5 times to get to 36. Now you only have to add less than half. Getting to 50 has got to be easy now. It's just a little heave.
You're trying to tempt me to be mathematical, aren't you? I suppose the closer you get to the population average, the more difficult it does actually get, I think, Mark. So
I suppose because your available population
from a starting
point
of being very far away from the population average.
Because so it's quite easy to jump up, isn't it? I suppose, yeah. And I suppose if you're a country that never had any phones and then suddenly mobile phones have been invented, you don't have to bother laying loads of copper cable, which is expensive. Someone else can leapfrog us and go straight to 5G.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're saying once you're at 36, you can get quite comfortable there, and because you've got to find how to get the extra 14 is not that easy.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Maybe the best way to think of it is going onto that diet, right? You make progress to start with, but you have to keep the discipline up. And it's all about pipeline of people. So even recently, I've been invited into a conversation to discuss the pipeline of female talent in terms of senior underwriting roles. And depending on what information you look at, that maybe has reached a bit of a static position. So we need to think about the next 5 or 10 years. Like, it's really trying to think about that. I suppose it never ends, does it?
Because even if you get to 50, if you then take your foot off the gas, then you'll be back at 36 before you know it.
Maybe, yes, yeah. I suppose it's about switching into a different gear and just keeping that focus on how representative is my employee base. The benefits are just absolutely clear of having a more diverse workforce in the first place. As I heard someone say the other day, inclusion has to come first because that's the benefit to everyone, but there's absolutely a massive benefit for the way organizations think and act. We as an organization have been through a lot and we're in a really good place now. I would like us to be the very best prepared we can for the future. And that also depends on the talent base and the people out there in the market as well.
Is that kind of diversity of thought, having interesting people around the table saying, have you thought about doing it this way?
Yes.
Rather than if they're all 5 public school boys, they're probably going to say exactly the same thing.
Coming back to our strategy, it is about generating opportunities, and that really comes from looking at things from different perspectives as well. As much as being able to source some ideas, it's actually how you think about those ideas as well, and we've really seen benefit from that.
What else might be on your wish list? For example, we've got the technological revamping of the market, the fundamental plumbing of the market to fully digitise that. Would you be asking them to crack on with that, and if they could produce a magic wand and make it work immediately?
Well, we've clearly been on a path with that under the current leadership for the last few years. Yes, I was sort of taking that as a given that has to be one of the top priorities there. That plus, I also think it's a priority coming in to recognise a little bit what we talked about, where the market cycle is changing, and actually Lloyd's does have a role to play. I think they've played a really positive role in the past in helping to manage the performance of the market. But the digitisation agenda really is something that can shift the market forward. It could enable lots of people's businesses to operate on a different level. Another example of where they can raise the bar, certainly, or really, I suppose, lower the bar for people to make it easier to transact. In that case, maybe they're lowering the bar.
Certainly, whenever I talk to technologists, they're so impatient that once we get this done, we've got all the second order and third order things that follow from this. We've got them already out of the box. I mean, they're ready to go. Then we'll be able to get things moving really, really fast. But the frustration is obviously you've got to build the railway first before you can put the TGV running on it.
That's definitely true. And in the meantime, I suppose there's quite a lot of potential opportunities in the sort of AI space, where there's a number of people, some of whom we work with, who are trying to make the current process and how you transact business easier through application of AI tools and those sorts of abilities. And we've done a number of things in that space, but it would actually help if the market as a whole moved forward and had a more common basis of transacting business.
Yeah, it'd be nice to get immediately straight through once you pressed a couple of the right buttons, and you could have everything done, and all your compliance, and your reporting, and everything else.
And underwriter workbench.
And feeding back into your models.
Where you can just look straight at your portfolio. I remember working with a colleague some years ago when I worked in risk, who was in investment risk management, and he couldn't understand why at the end of every day we didn't know where all our risks were. because
that was the classic value at risk. I suppose if someone's working financial markets, other financial markets, the faster moving ones,
yes.
VAR, they need to know what's the position.
Yeah. But in reality, there's only effort, willingness to get us there. We could get there. That is a possible future, and it is something that would be really good to aim for. Maybe we can put that on the agenda of the CEO and chairman as well. Then.
Yeah, but on that technology, let's take it for given that this will get fixed pretty soon, hopefully sometime in 2025 or if not early 26. How far do you think some of the phenomena that have already begun can go? For example, what about automatic follow underwriting, that kind of thing? How do you look at that yourself? As a CEO with your sort of background, would I be putting words in my mouth and saying, well, you might quite like that?
As a concept, yes, it has a part to play. When I think about that, I think a bit about how the client perceives it, though. And that, to me, is the natural break on how much of that type of business you might see in the market, because clients do benefit from people in the underwriting process, from underwriters, the input they
Something
have.
has to be led before it can be followed.
Yes, yeah. I suppose the lead follow concept is definitely a thing, but even so, we don't always lead business, but we do have a lot of opportunity to talk to the brokers, to have some input into structuring products and what the answer might be for the client. And you will lose that if, say, you switch to a market where it's a huge follow part, or there's one leader and lots of people just in a pure follow capacity. I do think you lose something there. There's absolutely something to be said for brokered business of the type that we write, for there to be an ability to talk to several markets and to get a better conclusion.
Yes, from a broking perspective, you need to have that alternative lead in your mind as well to know who might be able to take this on if something changes, as we know things change.
Yeah.
As you're planning, you're thinking, in 3 or 4 years' time, I've got the feeling that these people are not going to be leading this business. I don't know why. I've got a feeling in my bones, but at least I know I've got a very strong slip of people who know this business very well who could take it over.
Yes, like you say, that is a sort of reassuring factor to clients and brokers that they have got other people on the slip who can pick things up as needed. Having said that, I would come back to my starting point that it does have a place in the market. Many years ago, these days I seem to be a collection of my previous experiences, I suppose, but many years ago I went to a presentation by Clayton Christensen, who I think is famous for his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, but it's all about disruption in markets.
Yeah.
And I remember him giving a presentation, and this may not come across well on the podcast, but there's basically a curve. So if you think of a curve going from bottom left to top right, and this idea of disruption in markets is that disruption always comes from the bottom end of a market, the simpler type of products, and then it starts to move up to more complicated products. And I suppose, in essence, there's going to be some of that in our market, right? Some elements of our product work like that. But it really depends, because we write 40 plus lines of business. We write business through delegated. We write open market. We write reinsurance. There's elements of our book of business which are quite far away from being disrupted in that sense. And then there's elements which actually, rather than disrupted, will just benefit how we run a lot of our delegated authorities, for example, by actually having some really good technical infrastructure behind those relationships. That just helps us transact that business better. It helps us deliver a better service to the cover holder and therefore to the client. So there are ultimately positives out of all of this. I don't see it as a threat to the business. I see it as a really good opportunity.
I suppose, like with delegated, if you've got real time, you can look through into anything which has Amlin paper behind it, MS Amlin paper.
Yeah.
It can only be beneficial. You can also be helping them underwrite their own book as well, which, they're getting added value out of you saying, have you spotted this thing?
Oh, yeah. No, you're really getting into fantasy land of the ideal is where you're able to play things back directly down the chain to people to say, in our view, we've noticed this. It's a bit like Lloyd's with their view can see the whole market, and sometimes there's things that they can observe, they play back in their market messages. We can do something similar in terms of what we can play back to a number of our clients, and that's a real value add we can give.
You're going to need that technology to be there. Otherwise, we'll never know. Otherwise, if we're stuck with bordereaux, we're waiting for sort of 3-month historical view of what was done, and also an imperfect view because it might just have the name of an insured on it and a limit.
Yes.
It doesn't give you any information anyway, other than it's got a premium and a limit.
Over recent years, probably quite a few years now, there's been some step up in the straightforward level of quality of those things. But timing-wise, there's absolutely still a variety of timescales as to how often you get your information, how forward-looking it is. And that's something which a better technology ecosystem for the market would absolutely enable that. Like I said before, I suppose some of the things we're doing is working with partners ourselves in order to be able to benefit from some of the technology that they have so that we can speed that flow of information up. We tend to do it that way, not uniquely that way, but we tend to do it that way because actually that's quicker for us to implement if we're working with a third party who actually has got a good solution in place. And mainly we're just looking at our interaction with them rather than trying to plumb something in. It's when you get to infrastructure plumbing that it can become a lot more difficult and it's a lot slower process. But
do you think we'll get big expense savings? The last time I had John Hill speak on this, he said you get the expense saving because it allows you to do twice as much. It still costs you the same nominal amount. Whenever you replace one IT system with another, it still costs you 200 million a year to maintain it or whatever it is. But it may enable you to do twice as much or 3 times as much with the same amount of resource.
I suppose there is something like that potentially in evidence. I suppose when you were talking, I was thinking about things like the benefit of moving to the cloud. So benefit of moving software and technology to the cloud is fantastic, but what you find yourself doing is you find yourself doing twice as much analysis because you can. And
yes, you don't save any money, but you're adding tons more value.
Yeah, so it's twice as much because you can, but it's because it's driven by a need to really understand the risk more deeply. So there are all sorts of benefits to that. And it's something that just wasn't possible before.
And you're never going to go back, are you? So, I really want to put it all in a big server in the basement.
No, I imagine it would be difficult to argue that you sort of take stuff off the cloud and, like you say, you'd start arguing for more on-premises servers to house all this.
You mentioned about AI. Yes, where do you think the best use cases are? I often talk to people, and it seems to be more about helping the underwriter get rid of boring things. Obviously, why not just ingest that broker submission and have it all kind of ready for me? I can go make a cup of tea and come back, and then it'll all be ready for me to properly underwrite. Is that the way you look at things? Or do you ever think there are places where that underwriter might be removed from the equation? I don't know. Or maybe in some of those more commoditized lines of business, perhaps.
The use cases for us are, again, it's a little bit how we see our underwriting portfolio. I suppose it's actually quite a few smaller use cases. There's one that's close to my heart. Maybe I'll talk about that to start with. But when we've been trying to implement a more structured approach to underwriting ESG influenced risks, one of the things that we've done is we've put a simple AI-driven tool together, but one that basically just allows us to get a straightforward report on a client. And the value of that is that I'm actually getting an objective view of that client. That's not to say that placement information doesn't tell you a lot about the client, but actually just looking for sources of information yourself to tell you about the background of that client. Have they been involved in litigation? What sort of issues have they had in terms of their finances? These are all things you need to think about when you're trying to assess the ESG quality or a client through a sustainability lens. And that's been a tool that hasn't taken a lot to implement, and I can literally get a report back in less than 10 minutes on any company. It's the very example of trying to get information to enhance the decision-making process, because in the ESG space, we implemented some underwriting guidelines in 2023, and maybe to everyone who's a casual observer of that, you think, oh, you've got guidelines, that's great, so everything just fits in the tram lines that you've got. But in the ESG space, that is absolutely not true, because it is all about lots of grey areas, and you have to really think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So to me, being able to get an objective source of information to help support the decision-making process that my underwriters have to take, and things when they come through to me as a referral, because they often do in that space, has been really useful. to our ability to transact business.
You might be able to then automate some of that, refine those rules so that there are less referrals.
Well, maybe. I suppose, to be fair, in this particular tool, there's a little scoring box, but I haven't yet gone to the point where I just look at the score. I tend to read the 3-page report instead, because a score out of 1 is just maybe an oversimplification of what is usually a complex situation. So we've got that tool. We've been doing things for a while in our claims space. So we have a bionic claims triaging tool, which is really useful to the team and really help them, again, to concentrate on higher value claims activities. We have a claims proposition that has a focus on transparency, responsiveness, understanding the claim, being solution driven and technically excellent. You want that team and those people to really concentrate on the service we offer clients, which has to be at that more difficult to manage end of the spectrum rather than smaller claims where you can triage those down quite quickly.
So it's kind of like, I've only got half an hour left in the day before I go home. Which one shall I do out of these 20 on my list? And the AI is helping, saying, this is way the most important use of your time right now, because this needs to be dealing with right now, and this could be quite big. This needs instructing or whatever. There's something needs to happen now.
Yes. So the last thing I would say is that in the underwriting, we've been partnering with a third party, a little bit like I described before. Was one of the ways we like to try to implement some of these things, but a third party, which is essentially has helped us to put an algorithm in place so that we can filter the type of risk we like to see in certain classes that passes through their business. So basically, that has allowed us to simplify the underwriting process, and for a small proportion of our business, but it's something that we would like to grow over time.
So that's another triaging for the underwriter to say, right, I want to do some underwriting. Which is the most beneficial one, the one that will add the most value to the most people?
Yes, I suppose in essence, it's saying take a particular class of business and think of your strategy and appetite. What describes the characteristics and the risks that you like to see? So it challenges people because you have to put things down on paper. You can't be opportunistic down on paper or into a model. You have to actually start putting it into black and white of these are the types of risks I like and why, these line sizes, this is what I would write. But once you put it together, you can actually apply it to risks coming in, and that can really help you as a filtering mechanism to get to those key risks that fit your appetite. And so you can match things up and say, right, I'm actually happy with the end result because I'm getting what I want.
And in Burke, you can get an answer really quickly as well, which they're going to love.
Yes, definitely.
What about for a CUO? If you're the ultimate Blofeld, don't you want to have a big screen where you can just all these buttons and knobs and things to dial and press and say, right, I'm going to change our appetite in political risk over here, and then I'll dial up in wildfire over in LA now the prices are going up?
Yes, well, I back to what we talked about earlier. Ideally, you'd be able to do that on a daily basis, maybe.
And they have an assistant saying, Martin, have you seen this? Have you seen what's going on? Or little Martin?
I suppose in essence, that is the job, but it doesn't happen in a big Blofeld chair, and I don't have this monumental screen. I have a couple of screens on my desk. But there are things I come in and look at every day. We have somewhat of an underwriter workbench, so I can check the things that are most important. Would I like to be able to do that more frequently? Absolutely. Maybe that means I change my mind more often or we make changes more frequently. But I've seen research that's been done before in terms of responsiveness in managing your portfolio is just one of the really key things. I'm not saying you don't have to be right in your decision making. Being right would be good as well. But again, a lot of decisions...
I suppose at least you're a reserving actuary. You can see what goes wrong is when things change, you make all these assumptions and then you haven't necessarily been paying attention enough to the reality. And then there's a lot of small changes have happened.
Yes.
And they aggregate into very big numbers, suddenly becomes 100 million before you know it. And you think, is that really literally because cars, their bumpers, fenders cost more to fix than they used to? And you think, well, probably it is, but it's something I should have noticed.
Or the car fender is now sort of, just an inbuilt part of a carbon fibre body and you have to replace the whole thing as soon as you get it.
In the 1970s, you just bolt a new one on and Bob's your uncle.
Yes, yeah. But the ideal scenario is relentlessly looking at that portfolio. If you want to get to the concept of an optimal portfolio, it just means that you can't rest and you have to keep looking at that. And any tools that we can implement, piecemeal or otherwise, that just help to do that on parts of our portfolio or large parts of our portfolio, that's something that we're always looking at. And we've been able to make some progress on, and we definitely will continue.
Just having that data and then that ability to see, I don't know, why is this broken arm 20% more than others? Is this the start of some new trend? Let's have a debate about this, or is it just a weird one?
Yeah, so it's to try to get to that decision point as quickly as you can.
I think we've come to the end of my long list of different things that I wanted to talk about, and we've added loads of others sort of in response to things that you've said, Martin. I've really enjoyed my conversation with you. Is there anything we want to add that we haven't said, that we've glossed over?
There's one thing I would add, if you're giving me the open mic opportunity, literally, and that's to just say, when I'm talking about 2025 and how we're making steps forward in our strategy, I talked about a casualty treaty team. I would also like to emphasize the fact that actually this year we have a word of the year, and that's partnerships. And that fits in lots of different places, but a really important element of that is the partnerships that we're growing within our MS and AD group. So we have this enormous set of group companies. We've been doing various bits and pieces, but we're really bringing it together. We had a press release only the other week on the partnerships team that we've set up, and that's to give it a personality and a space to operate in, a real identity. But we've been working with our colleagues in the US, in Asia, and more recently, and most importantly, so I'm really glad you gave me this opportunity, we set up a dual stamp capacity with our MSRG UK colleagues who are sitting not far from where we are now. And all of that just helps to signify that as a group, and I've been here for a while, we actually have got these superpowers that are now starting to come to the fore. And that's part of why I'm so excited about this job and our business and our prospects going forward, because not only have we got partnerships that we're building with clients and we're sort of looking at them and working on broadening things out with them, but we've really been able to make some progress on building out those partnerships inside our group, which means we're coming up with new ways of distributing our product, new ways of accessing those clients, and actually bringing that business into the London market.
You're right. It's one of the most exciting things about this data technological revolution would be because conglomerates have existed and global insurance companies have existed for a long time now, but then often they are just a group of companies owned by a large holding company somewhere. And sometimes, there's 50 different balance sheets all over the world. They're a large and resilient organization, but do any of those bits actually know what the other bits are doing? Not really. And now, I suppose if you can really make that start to work, then you can see some very powerful synergies, can't you? If you've got these fantastic specialty products, but are not being distributed everywhere, they could be distributed by some of your retail colleagues all over the world. And so, if you want to do K&R or you want to do slightly high end this or the other, then did you know that we do this in London and we can now distribute that here with some of your expertise? That could be very powerful.
I need to co-opt you to do some of the marketing with our colleagues around the world, Mark. But that is exactly hitting it on the head.
These are enormous tasks because they work in theory, but in practice, it's just chipping away slowly. And you can't build relationships without actually building relationships. You have to go there. You've got to get to know everybody, start to really trust each other, start to really work together, get that continuity and deliver for each other and realize it is worth doing. Because sometimes you can get enthusiastic about it because head office wants you to talk to each other, but actually it's only when you actually see, oh, well, this is actually producing something that my top line and bottom line are both benefiting from this. You can say, well, let's carry on, and it becomes organic at that point.
Yeah, and we're not doing that in a vacuum. It's not just about MS Amlin. We're actually doing that, again, in order to raise the game of colleagues in our group companies as well, right? There's a whole drive and push there of things we can learn from each other. It's not a one-way street. It's actually a complete two-way communication mechanism we have in place.
They're close on the ground, and that's where new products are going to come from because there are new problems that particular to a particular market. Then maybe, or if you solve that problem in that market, it may be applicable to other markets as well. So that'll be a long process, and that's genuinely global. So I wish you all the best with that. Well, thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed our chat.
Thanks very much, Mark. Really great to be on. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this programme. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience because you know you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry.
The Voice of Insurance is produced in association with Advantage Go. Release your underwriters to underwrite with Advantage Go's underwriting platform.
Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.